these distributors combine. So these distributors combine the activities of the strictly wire business, which is a distribution segment, and the retailing activity, which is a commercial one. And in addition to this, we have lack of access to electricity and low demand for energy access, for electricity where there is access. So in response to the scenarios that's happening in Africa, there are some new developments that are coming to the retailing or electricity retailing business activities. And these things are on a pilot-based mode right now, and they have been tested in some countries. And that basically is what we are going to discuss in today's today's webinar. So these distributors, in addition to actually providing or selling electricity to their customers, they are also some of them are also engaging in commercial activities, which could be mined or light, such as providing equipments or appliances that run on electricity, to a more intense ones that involve actually getting involved in industrial or commercial activities by the distributors themselves. And this raises some issues. So that basically is what we are going to look at today. Hopefully we will have panelists from the business side who are entrepreneurs and a regulator. So that basically is overview of this webinar. And let me give the floor to Dr. Nyang to say a few words before we proceed. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us in this webinar today. We are very excited to have you with us. As you know, we at the African School of Regulation, one of the things that we do is to engage with stakeholders, and we like to do that through webinars, through conferences, and also through policy dialogues. So today we are engaging you through a webinar. It's on a very interesting topic, basically recognizing the fact that in many countries in Africa, distribution and retailing are still bundled. Many countries in Africa have not unbundled their sectors completely. And even some of those that have done have unbundled partially, so that they have not gone the whole way. So there are some very interesting things that comes out of this. And the big question that arises is how we deal with it from a regulatory perspective, which I think is what the panelists will be discussing with us today. I think we have a good panel today, and they are going to help us unravel this. We expect that you'll be participating fully. We expect many questions from you and contributions, which the panelists will handle. And at the end of it all, I think we will have a fairly good idea what the thinking is behind this interesting topic that we're looking at today. So with those few remarks, I would like to say again, welcome. Enjoy the participation, enjoy the webinar. And let me take you back to your host today, Keno, who is going to be hosting this webinar along with the panelists that we have invited to shed light on this very interesting topic that we're looking at today. Thank you very much and welcome again. Back to you, Ken.
Thank you, Dr. Frederick, for that opening remark. And as many of you might know, we at ASR run a series of webinars on different topics, and this is one of them. And we have also had other webinars previously, which you can access them on our website. So let me start by introducing my panelists today. My first panelist is Harold Obiga. He is a seasoned regulatory, power, and renewable energy lawyer. And he's also a very active participant in our training course. And he's currently serving as the Director of Legal Services for the Electricity Regulatory Authority of Uganda. Mr. Harold, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Keno. Thank you.
And my second panelist, I'm not sure if he's able to join us. He's having some issue with his connection, I guess. But let me introduce him, and we will have him somewhere along the webinar. And he is Mr. Nico Peter Schmidt. Mr. Nico is a seasoned entrepreneur and energy expert with nearly 20 years of experience in the sector. And he is a co-founder and CEO of Inensas, a consultancy in rural electrification using sustainable mini-grid business models. I hope he will be able to join us. And with that, of course, we were supposed to have a third panelist who excused himself because of a very unfortunate and matters beyond his control. So I would like to apologize to my audience on that. And before I go to the actual content of the webinar, I'd like to remind the audience that you can make use of the chat box to post your questions to our panelists, and they will address it as we get along through the webinar. And with that, let's start the issue. So I'll ask Harold to provide us a bird's eye overview of electricity retailing in Africa, and by, for instance, giving us how that segment is remunerated and the challenge that business activity is currently facing in Africa. And basically, that would give us a starting point for what we will be discussing in this webinar. So let me give the floor to Harold.
Thank you, Keno. That's quite an overview, and I think if everyone has really come, most likely I think most of the people who are attending it may have an idea. So there are really two ways in which we can look at electricity distribution and retailing. The first, I think, that we tend to think about is the common way we all approach electricity distribution and retailing, especially in our markets. That is, it is as part of a vertically integrated utility. I think predominantly that is what we see across the board, right? There are also elements, that's the first element. The second element that I think we begin to see beginning to be discussed in the market, that we see, for instance, in South Africa, that we see in Uganda, that we see in Kenya, that we see in a number of countries on the continent, in Ghana and all that, is the element where we begin to have the lines business. Now focusing not just on the lines alone, but doing both the network and the retailing. And that is the second aspect, which I think when we come to distribution proper and retailing proper, that is what we are really most concerned with. And that's where I think my discussion is largely going to focus, because one, it's what I am familiar with, but also it's also what I have seen predominantly rolling out. Then the third aspect, which largely, and I want to distinguish in that two aspects. The first aspect where it's being done as part of a main grid. The grid runs throughout the concession area, throughout the country. And the second aspect where it's being done as part of, say, a microgrid or as part of a mini grid, and it's distribution and retailing in part. And I think that's where we are also largely thinking in terms of what are some of these interventions and one of the business models that we are beginning to see to roll out on the market. Now, naturally, each of these models is determined first, of course, by the path that the country wants to take in terms of possibly liberalization and also introducing private sector participation into the market. But also it doesn't mean that it, for instance, can only be done with private sector participation. It can still be done by government participation. So in terms of that, we are thinking of who are the actors, who are the people. Is it going to be just distribution and retailing alone? Is it going to be distribution, generation, and supply all together combined? And there are different reasons. But I think the key reasons which we are looking at are always similar across the board. We're either looking at a question of financing and cost of financing at that, but also the ability to attract financing. Or we're also looking at a question of efficiency in terms of how efficient is this utility? Is it able to, for instance, is it able to provide electricity as and when is required for the specific purposes for which the electricity is available or needed, whether it is commercial, industrial, or residential. And we commonly think of that as the SAIDI and the CAIFI, and the SAIFIO of the market in terms of quality and efficiency. Then the third reason I think that we tend to begin thinking and zeroing down on the distribution and retailing market is also in terms of access. There is a strong element of access which comes, and which I don't think we should forget, because at the end of the day, it is the distributor and the retailer who is deliberately interfacing with the end user and end consumer. So that too becomes quite important for distribution retailing. If you think through those three aspects, that is the financing, that is the efficiency, and that is the access. And these are not exhaustive. There can be a whole host of other reasons as to why you're looking at the market like this. Then you come to the question of the market model. What do you specifically want? And I'm going to try and speak to the main grid model, and then in part also see how that can be juxtaposed with the model where you're running the main grid model, but it's interspersed with microgrids around the country. Now, what we see in this is first of all, when we have distribution and retailing being part of a market and being combined together, the major reason why we see this is commercial viability of the distribution and retailing market. That may be the major reason why these two things, first of all, are combined as one, is first of all because we are not able to distinguish between the distribution and selling of power. And then if we do that, it will make our business model not commercially viable. And that is what I think we have seen. At the end of the day, we are looking at how can you make this distribution, utility, and retailing business financially viable. So what we see is that these markets that are able to combine distribution and retailing are much easier able to address issues of efficiency, issues of access, and then issues of reliability, and then of course attracting of financing, because basically they have a broader level at which they are able to compete. We haven't seen a market model where distribution is completely separated from retailing a lot on the African continent. Now, I'm going to then speak to the second aspect, which I think we begin to see in this, is that because in hard to reach areas, because not able to roll out the main grid. Sorry, did you lose me there? Is my internet connection fine?
Yeah, but for a bit, but now we can hear you.
Okay, for now it's fine.
That's
So
fine.
Reason being is, where was I? So because you're not able to have everyone on the grid for the reason that it's not still again commercially viable. We've had interspersed microgrids coming in and they are proximate to the main grid. And these are largely coming in to promote the business model where these hard to reach communities for which it is not possible to extend the grid can actually then begin having access to electricity. And what we see in this model that comes up where we begin to see these microgrids, these small grids that are not connected to the grid, is that they begin to introduce, they don't just do only electricity business, all right? They are looking at appliance financing as one of the areas. Now in this, there are also interesting scenarios where the utility is just not concerned with appliance financing, that is the end consumer, but can also be concerned with overall, not philanthropic, but infrastructure development. For instance, a utility can be part of a whole consortium which is doing health. For instance, it is part of a hospital. Okay, so providing varied services, not just appliance financing, or it can be combined and is providing, or is part of a consortium, or part of a whole-term project which provides electricity, which provides water, which provides roads in a community. And it is still one consortium with different segments doing all those things. Reason being, at the end of the day, what has become evident that it's not just enough to, I think, deliver electricity or to go into the electricity business. But what is the add-on that electricity is trying to facilitate? Is it access to maybe a specific good coming to the market, in which case the utility looks at not just the utility business of electricity, but also looks at infrastructure like a road or a ferry if it is an island? Is it maybe access to maybe a market, like say if it is fishing, in which case the utility does not just do the electricity business, but also provides maybe coolers to an island, provides a fish processing plant, provides something, and that is at commercial scale. Then the last and the smallest segment is when the utility now begins combining its business model and also providing appliances or direct products to a number of specific, to individual consumers, not at the commercial level or industrial level, but individual consumers. And this can be varied. It can be from fridges, it can be from radios, we have seen TVs, we have seen milling machines, we have seen something that, drives this incentive that we're not giving you this electricity for the basic of just having this electricity, but so that, at the end of the day, the electricity can be able to uplift people from poverty, provide better access to health, provide better education, and ultimately also increase income viability. And that is, I think, the business model that is strongly beginning to think of. One of the biggest challenges ultimately that we have with that, for us as regulators and as a communities, is the need to be able to segregate the respective costs. Because at the end of the day, as a regulator, my commitment to a utility is that when you come into this market, irrespective of the business model, and I want to underscore the fact that as regulators, we tend not to regulate business models. No. At the end of the day, I am majorly concerned with the service that you are putting forward, which is the electricity business. I look at the add-ons to the extent that, one, they are not providing for cross subsidies between the service that I am mandated to regulate, because I also, as a regulator, am set up by an act of parliament. I'm set up with limitations which tell me I can only deal with the electricity business. So for instance, if I can only deal with the electricity business, I may not have the authority to go into looking into fishing business. You understand that? Or I may not be able to regulate a road, or I may not be able to regulate maybe a telecommunications service. So all these things are things that we need to think of. That's the first point. So I'm interested in this to this utility model to the extent that, one, I am not allowing for cross subsidies. I am allowing for transparency in it in terms of segregation of accounts, in order to avoid cross subsidies, but also to avoid electricity consumers from possibly carrying a high burden, which they shouldn't be, which they shouldn't be carrying, and then to also make the utility specifically whole. The other challenge that we specifically see as regulators in this is the commercial viability. All right, that it has become evident that if this business is just to do only electricity business, it's not going to be commercially viable. So it's almost like a chicken and egg situation, all right? You are not really concerned with the appliances, but they are beneficial to the electricity business, which you are regulating. So then you begin to put in place measures and think through and incentives to see that if this person engages in this, to what extent can he do it in a viable manner, and the business specifically continues. That's the second challenge that we face. The third challenge in terms of viability and cost, the third challenge that we see ultimately in some of these is that the commercial viability of where this model is being rolled out. It's there are significant challenges on affordability. So today it's very easy for me to set out a project concept, a memo, and think through it, an application, a license, and I'll license the project. But 2 or 3 years down the road, is this project going to be available? And if it's not available, what is the alternative? Because from the moment that someone consumes electricity, it's not possible for you the next time to come back and tell them you are not going to consume electricity because the utility that was providing you that electricity has abandoned the network. And we have seen instances where networks are actually abandoned for a number of reasons in this second model that I'm talking about. Maybe the costs, the grant financing that was initially relied upon has since been wiped out and the business is no longer viable. Even it cannot cover its own basic operation and maintenance. And yet at the end of the day, I as a regulator, I want to see that this is a business that earns a return that is reasonable. And this is a business that also earns the costs for which it has actually put in. And the business is actually not doing that. And those are some of the 3 or 4 challenges that we tend to think through or encounter in the market when we come to this business model, where you are combining not just the electricity and retailing business model as one, but also adding on other add-ons, whether it is major infrastructure services, whether it is appliances that you're adding on, whether it is some philanthropic purposes. Now, I want to speak to that and say that it's not necessarily a gloom and doom. We have outliers who have significantly excelled at this. For instance, if it's a biomass project, all right, and it's possibly it's people whom it is dealing with are dealing in coffee, or they are dealing in cocoa, or they are dealing in vanilla. That income from the vanilla, from the coffee, from the whatever, and then the husks are being used for the biomass project, those businesses are viable, all right? But there are others where if the other add-on in which the utility is actually engaging in is suffering a market downturn, or doesn't have as lot of very high windfall projects like another, that utility actually collapses. So in a way, I think as businesses and as utilities and retailers begin to combine these 2 things together and look at the end use of what is the appliance that they are going to add on, what is the business that they are trying to support. They also have to look beyond, first of all, the electricity market, but also this other business. And how viable is it? How is it going to grow? What are its projections? For how long? And then ultimately, they also have to begin thinking of diversifying this end business where you are retailing. Those are my more than 2 cents on your question that you asked, Ken.
Right. Thank you for that extensive insight to the issue. And in fact, you have touched upon the next question I was about to ask you, which was more of a specific one. And interestingly, some of these new developments are happening in Uganda. For instance, Equatorial Power and Mandulis Energies can be taken as good examples in this innovative business models. So, what were your reaction as a regulator to this new development in the retailing sector? Because they also have their own motivations, which would be commercial or to cross subsidize their other regulated business segment. But what were your reactions as a regulator to these new developments in let's say your jurisdiction in Uganda as a regulator? Sorry, you are muted.
All right, thank you. What were our reactions? And I want to say that we have more than Equatorial Power. We have more than Mandulis. Some of the other areas that I spoke about, like one which is a fully integrated infrastructure company. We have a company called Kalangala Infrastructure Services that has been around for more than 10 years. I think there's quite a lot to learn from how that was specifically developed. We also have another project that was designed with specific support towards tourism, and tourism being its backbone. We also have another project that was designed with specific support towards vanilla and cocoa growing. We also have another project that also was done, we called it Utility 2.0, which was done in collaboration with a main utility provider. Then we also have others, which are now also integrated with key infrastructure. One is integrated with communication infrastructure, radio, and all that. Then the second one is also integrated with hospitals, right? That is Kisizi Hospital. Then we also have another called Kuluva Hospital. So all these are three. These are different models that we are looking at. What was our reaction as a regulator? Our first reaction, first of all, is to realize that, first of all, as a regulator, you have a gap. The reason why I say that reaction is important is that this is a business model which is business unusual. But at the end of the day, it is able to provide the service that you want, which is electricity. So what we try to do is create a certain level of light-handed sandboxing regulation for these entities. And that is what we have done for them. We've created a method which eases their ability to be regulated. For feasibility studies, and after doing
Sorry, we are losing
feasibility studies, did you lose me somewhere? You're losing me. Are you able to hear me now?
No, it's better. Yes, it's better now. Thank you.
Now it's fine?
It is fine now. Yeah, please.
It's now fine?
It is fine. Yeah,
so what I mentioned is that what we've done for this is we've first of all created and in no structure way, we have created a pseudo method and apply a certain level of light-handed regulation for them. So we first of all don't apply the normal stringent licensing or permitting conditions to them. That's one of the things that we've done as regulators. The second thing that we have done as regulators, is to look at viability. And how have we addressed the issue of viability? So for instance, ordinarily, we have changed our methodology of regulation, which is we typically have been licensing by area or by site or by a definite area. Like say, if Uganda was a concession, we'd only license you for Uganda and not Africa. But now we, for instance, allow you to develop a business model that allows you to spread out your mini grids to a much larger area. That is, in other words, to combine more than one site of location. And we have seen that being able to make some of these areas financially viable. The third thing that we've done as regulators is to introduce and encourage competition in these specific segments, all right? We are currently running a tender. The government of Uganda is currently running a tender for about 156 mini grid sites, which will have something to do with that. These are combined sites, very many sites, and it's going to be done competitively under the Global Energy Transform project with a view of meeting costs that go with this specific project. That's one of our other reactions as a regulator that we've done. The other thing that I think as regulators, we need to do when we come across and we are confronted by some of these business models is to actually be open-minded and begin to recognize them for what they actually are. The reason I say we need to be open-minded, some of these, that they're not going to fit into your usual nitty-gritties and your new boxes. So for instance, when you realize that a project is not going to be financially viable as a regulator, and that comes out very clear in the analysis, but the project does something, produces electricity, and you know that even if you're to charge a cost-reflective tariff, this project is not going to succeed. What do you do? One of the things you try to do is in stakeholder management is getting these projects in line with, for instance, the government of Uganda or the government to see if they can provide subsidies, right, in this area. The other thing which we have not yet done, but which we are considering, which I think is also important to look into, is how can the main grids that are close to these new business models actually support these new business models. The reason I say this is that we've had one project, I think it was Power for All Utility 2.0, which did something almost similar to this business model where you're combining retailing, distributing, and appliances or different products. And after the project was financially viable, the main utility, who is Umeme Limited, took over this specific utility area, which had about maybe 300 customers or something like that. So it shows that in terms of proximity, but when this becomes viable, this business that is there no longer needs to stay and can move its assets, its key assets that, for instance, are like generation, it can move those assets and move them to and go and do the same aspect somewhere else. And then the main utility can interconnect, of course, subject to payment of an appropriate compensation mechanism that is pre-agreed at the beginning. So those have been some of our reactions to see that we can make this as viable as possible as regulators. Thank you, Ken.
Actually, it's no wonder that all these new business models are happening in Uganda, because as we've just described, in fact, you have not only innovative retailing activities, but also even your regulation itself is sort of innovative and is open and is attractive to such commercial and innovative activities. And that speaks volumes, actually, where you have good regulation and innovative regulation, they say, then other innovations will also follow, and it's a good lesson for everyone. With that, let me move to the other question, and I'll also invite Dr. Frederick Nyang if he would like to comment on this topic. And let me move to my third question, which focuses on this new business models that you have described and potential, or their potential, which is to promote productive use of energy, and also ultimately improvement in the commercial, in the economic and in the social lives of the communities in which they are engaging these activities. So my question is, since the distributor is best placed to sell appliances and to engage in commercial and industrial activities that are based on the electricity it is providing, what do you think, should the distributor be mandated to engage in such commercial activities? Because it's not his core business. So as a regulator, should you mandate a distributor to engage in commercial activities? Because on the one hand, it has its benefits to get engaged in such commercial activities, because it promotes productive use of energy and development. And on the other hand, it is also the distributor itself that's best placed to be engaged in such activities. So should the distributor be mandated to engage in such commercial activities? And how do you incentivize it to get involved in such activities? So these two are my questions. Thank you.
Keno, is that for me or Dr. Nyang?
Let's start from you, and then we will move to Dr.
All right.
Nyang. Right.
Okay. Should the distributor be mandated? I think in terms of mandate, the distributor may not be mandated. All right. Now that should they be mandated? Should it be compulsory? Should that be the case? The answer is not necessarily a clear-cut yes. All right. However, I want to add that when we choose to go for projects out there and say, for instance, are competitively bidding them out, that allows you to provide in the business model projected a certain element of productive energy use. So if, for instance, it's being done under competition, right? I think if we're doing it under competition and we know that this is a far to reach area, this can be mandated as part of the procurement and the bidding process, all right? But at the point at which, for instance, they then move to direct electricity licensing, you may not necessarily mandate it, because at this point in time as a regulator, you are majorly concerned with the output, which is the electricity. Now, what do you do as a regulator? One of the things, of course, you do is you put in place ring fencing rules, accounting standards, which you expect them to operate by. It really does help as a regulator if you do all this in advance for all utilities, instead of asking them to, for instance, develop their own independent ring fencing rules, accounting standards. You help them throughout, set up the templates, set up the standards, the Excel sheets, the reports, and all that, the methodologies, and make it as easy and as seamless as possible. And in a way, I think for me, that is how you incentivize utilities to actually not incur certain costs, but also understand that this is a lifeblood for them. Now, you also asked about incentives. What incentives can you provide? The biggest incentive we provide as a regulator is to ensure that you're able to obtain your costs. That is a reasonable rate of return for the capital you have invested and equity, and then of course a reasonable cost for that. For what you have incurred, that whatever you incur, you will get it out. That is the biggest and the most confident incentive that you can give any utility, I think, when it comes to this. But that said, There are also other incentives which we have come to see are important if you're going to have this business model viable. One of the incentives that definitely must come from, and this can be discussed to say who would provide this incentive, is subsidies. We know that if these business models are to be viable, you need a subsidy of possibly even 70%. And how can this subsidy be provided? It can, for instance, be provided by maybe the government taking over or connecting the infrastructure that is required, or connecting the lines, setting up the poles, setting up, that kind of thing. That can be done by the government. And that is a direct subsidy that goes into the network. And then this utility only being paid for maybe the generation assets and then the operation and maintenance. So are they able to opt? Now, the trick with that is that ultimately these assets that are set up there have to be maintained, have to be operated, but they also have a lifespan. So the question then comes up, when these assets expend their lifetime, who's going to replace them? If the transformer capacity is utilized, who's going to replace it? Who's going to think about that? Those are some of the challenges that you have to begin to think through. And but I think the most important thing is to start. Not all of them will be successful, but also those that will be successful will actually be there. So it's better to start out the business models, begin rolling them out, see what incentives you can provide, how you can deal with the challenges as and when they come up, and how you can resolve any difficulties along the road. Thank you.
Thank you. I have one question that came to mind when you just talked about subsidies and incentivizing them. So would that subsidies or incentives in general be also for the commercial part of what these distributors are doing, or would that be only for the strictly distributor activities such as transformers, the line? Because these innovative ideas are involving other activities other than the strictly distribution business. So are you also subsidizing that part of their business, or is your subsidies only covering for the strictly network aspect of their business?
So currently, what has happened for the appliance part of the business is that this subsidy actually goes only to the network infrastructure and then also maybe connection. So that is directly related to the electricity sector, all right? However, that said, if it is an integrated infrastructure project, all right? If it's an integrated infrastructure project that, for instance, has roads, has ferries, has a health center integrated, has maybe education integrated, has maybe an industry integrated, I see no reason why through different methods, all right, maybe the government can't directly, for instance, subsidize, say if it is a ferry. And if for a wholly integrated and wholly developed infrastructure project that is 3-circle, I don't see why subsidies cannot be extended to health, cannot be extended to ferries, cannot be extended to maybe education directly. So it's going to be dependent on two things. It's going to be dependent on the scale of the project. I do think that if it is a huge scale project, that is what I call a wholly integrated infrastructure project, that can be done. If it is principal purpose was really majorly electricity, I don't think that can be done for these other aspects. That then, because you've also got to incentivize the people who are getting subsidies to move to a commercial mindset and begin to utilize this electricity for productive use. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Nyang, would you like to add a bit on this issue?
Yes, not very much, but just a little based on my experience. One of the things that I noticed about a setup where you have the utilities providing services other than electricity for which they would be licensed, what I noticed is that the situation was such that the utilities were usually ahead of the regulator and they were usually ahead of the policymaker. So they had these ideas which they would then be trying to sell to the regulator and the policymaker, telling them, this is what we have and this is how we'd like to do it. And in many cases, because the regulator would be caught unprepared, and in many cases, maybe the policymaker government was also not ready for this. They would be caught without the appropriate legal framework or the regulations. So of course, in a situation like that, the regulator would be required to move very fast to consider the business, the innovative and emerging business models which the service providers were proposing. And of course, they would, as Harold has rightly pointed out, the regulator would then have to come in with standards so that they're not leaving.
I think we've lost.
Sorry, you lost me
lost
there.
you there.
Okay. I'm back now. Yes, okay. So that these issues of doing the standards would not be left to the service providers, but rather they would be dealt with by the regulator and the government. So the regulator would need to be very flexible and very nimble on their feet to take this on board. And this can be a challenge for the regulator because in many cases, regulators tend to be restricted by the legal framework within which they operate. And for them to make amendments or changes to that, it can be a lengthy process, sometimes requiring them to go all the way to Parliament. So there could be some impediments there. But in implementing this, I think using light-handed regulation where the regulator would allow the service provider to proceed with some of these business models is also a way that it can be done. I remember in my experience, I am familiar with at least 2 cases where the service provider, besides just being licensed to provide electricity services, were also providing productive uses, and they were doing that on their own initiative. And the 2 that I am familiar with were quite successful with it. Eventually, I think the regulator in Kenya probably took these ones on board. I've been out of touch with them for some time. I don't know if they progressed with that and made it viable. But having said that, the other thing that is important and which regulators need to take on board, and governments and policymakers also need to think about this, is that if you're thinking of a situation where we're dealing with off-grid service providers, probably based on solar PV systems or biomass or some such systems, we need to remember also that the interconnected grid also survives on subsidies which are provided by the government, and the government provides these services, these subsidies all the time. And I remember in my experience, some of the service providers who wanted to provide off-grid services were also asking us to consider extending these subsidies to them. And as at the time that my services with my former regulator expired, this was something that was being discussed in the circles in Kenya. I don't know if eventually they reached an agreement on whether these subsidies should be extended also to the off-grid services provided by the private sector. I'm not sure if they reached an agreement on that, but clearly that is something that governments all over Africa need to think about, because the service that the private sector is providing is an important service, and the clients who are benefiting from those services are also taxpayers. They could also benefit from the subsidies that are given by the government. So it is something that they need to think about seriously, and perhaps with time, the business models will also be able to incorporate that. So that would be my contribution to those points. Thank you, Ken.
Thank you for that insightful discussion, Dr. Nyank. Now let's move to the impact commercial activities have on the regulated activities of the distributors. Given the potential risks involved in these commercial activities, what regulatory instruments are there for the regulator to ensure that the distributor won't reduce investment in its core business because of failure of the commercial activities? How can you ensure as a regulator that the distributor continues investing in maintaining its core business activities? Let me ask this question, Harold.
Okay, how can you ensure that the distributor continues to invest? We haven't had a lifetime of projects, I think, over this business model. First of all, see if what we've put in place guarantees that, because I'm not talking of a 20-year period. I'm talking of just about 10 years, the longest being about 10 years. So one of the things that you, I think, need to do as a regulator is see at the end of the day, this company is able to recover the necessary costs. That's one of the basic things that I think as a regulator you need to be able to do. That guarantees the ability for them to may not make the business commercially viable to the extent of a satisfactory internal rate of return for the company. That's one thing, but at least as a minimum, the cost of these assets, can they be replaced? And when they make maybe an application, can they be replaced? Specific, can they be considered? And then the other thing, of course, is to also ask that if you're, as a regulator, you tend to review not just that today, but also that tomorrow. And that's the question that we ask. If you are getting a subsidy from the government of Uganda, maybe today, the question that we want to say is there a commitment that in the future, they will be able to replace your assets? We saw this for some of the earlier utilities where, for instance, the Rural Electrification Agency would actually make this commitment that should this utility fail to actually be able to invest at a certain time T or X, I maybe as a Rural Electrification Agency, I will actually invest on behalf of that utility. In other words, I'll replace the transformer, I'll provide it. And they were actually able to do this. So that's not necessarily the utility itself investing, because the utility will only honestly invest. And I think the expectation should be for the utility to only invest if something is commercially viable, if they're able to earn a reasonable rate of return on it, or they're able to recover all their costs that they're putting into the project. Asking over and above that from them as a utility, you may be punching above your weight, to say the least. And I think that's one of the things that regulators have to specifically take into account, but also the utilities themselves. Thank you.
So in continuation of your discussion, could that what you've just described help you to sort of control the distributors from cross-subsidizing one activity with another if their commercial activity fails? They will have to cross-subsidize that with regulated business activity. So what instruments do you have to control that aspects of their business?
The simplest thing that we do for cross subsidies is, first of all, to put in place accounting rules that require this business to be ring-fenced, all right? That this business must be ring-fenced. So even its reporting, we want a clear division of between what is the income coming from this other appliance and what is the income coming from the actual utility business. So this ring-fencing is actually put in place. But that said, we've also come to learn that it is important that even as you do this, you put in place a supplier of last resort framework. And who is the supplier of last resort? In our opinion, the supplier of last resort is the utility closest to this business utility. So if this business is located close to the main grid, the entity operating the main grid there is the first supplier of last resort. So we make it very clear to them. And for a number of these other business models which have failed, what we have seen is that the other way you can also do it is to have a government utility backstopping all of them and being there and ready to actually step in For instance, if there is a government utility which is not necessarily engaged in electricity distribution or supply in that area at the end of the day, but has a public service obligation, they will want to do this. So you put in place, first of all, the supply of last resort mechanism, and you test it because it's not unusual for this business to fail. And as a regulator, you are there, you receive a phone call. They tell you that the utility has disappeared. The person who was operating the plant has left, the assets are abandoned, and they are here, they are doing nothing, you know, that kind of thing. That's not completely unusual, and we see that. Then, of course, the other one is what I've mentioned. Cross-subsidization and putting in place ring-fencing rules is one of the ways that we try and guide these utilities. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Unless Dr. Nyang has more opinion, I would move to my last question.
Keno, I don't have additional information on that, except that the idea of having that supply of last resort is a very good idea. And I think if you look at the regulations for, perhaps this is something that is universally done, but I do know, for instance, in Kenya, that for the Rural Electrification Agency, then the law provided that there would be, the minister would find an entity that would take over as the supplier of last resort. But it's an important consideration to have in the law. And I think when the legal framework is being set up, that is something that lawyers are usually very keen to ensure that it is provided. It's provided for, so that if that entity should fail, then of course there would be an entity to take over. However, when we are dealing with the utilities that we are setting up, private sector utilities that are being set up in rural areas, perhaps in remote places, to provide services, that electricity services that generally do not exist. And these ones usually would be relying on support from donor funding, using grants where the government may not be involved. It is a challenge for the regulator to ensure that that provision is considered and taken care of. And I'm not sure that there are very many countries in Africa that are doing that, but perhaps we could actually learn from what is happening in Uganda. I think it would be a very good provision to have. That would be my contribution to that. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I move to my last question, I think Mr. Nico has just joined us. I would like to say welcome, Mr. Nico.
Yeah, sorry everyone. There obviously has been a mix-up of times, probably due to summer and winter time shift.
All right. I don't think he's able to hear us. So let me ask this final question. Could these business models accelerate access to electricity in remote rural areas of sub-Saharan Africa? Could they be the key to unlocking universal electrification in Africa? What do you think, Harold?
Okay. It's not the key. It's one of the keys that we can actually employ. Why do I say it's one of the keys? In some of the areas which we have seen, okay, we have seen maybe a company make a projection that is going to connect 3,000 customers in 5 years, and it's able to do that in 1 year. Extremely successful, all right? We have seen other entities which are only able to grow by about 10% over a 5-year period, over an annual period, all right? What are the differences in these two things that we have seen? One thing that we have seen, first of all, is the extent to which the community comes to own this project or become a part of the project or actually feel that the project is one of their own, right? In those cases, it's accelerated significantly, much more. But then there are also other things that come in. What is the commercial productive use that is actually being supported? If it is a commercial productive use that is not really significant, honestly, that does not grow, that is not growing by international and regional or local levels, then that access is just not going to happen. The third thing that we have also seen where this model works well is how proximate is it to the main grid? Is it so proximate to the main grid that it will grow in 1 year, that it will grow in 10 years, that the grid will arrive in 1 year, in 10 years, in 15 years, in 20 years, or possibly never? These three conditions, I think, answer that question to understand whether it is actually a model that you should begin to think of in terms of growing access. What is the business being that is being supported? How proximate is this utility to the main grid? How proximate is it to the main grid in terms of distance? For instance, will the grid arrive there in 1 year, in 2 years, in 10 years? And then last but not least is how involved are the stakeholders in this? Do they feel they are a part of it? Is it part of a unified ecosystem of existence? If these three things are adequately, I think, assessed, then the business model can work. If it fails, then if they're not adequately assessed, then you don't have as much success in these areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Harold, for that very, very insightful idea. So that brings us to the end of this discussion. So we've discussed that, yes, these business models can grow and can unlock electrification with the right regulation. And we have to ring fence the commercial activities and separately from the regulated activities for this to work. And we also need light-handed regulation. We have to address the issue of viability, and by introducing competition in the sector, this segment of the electrification activity can grow. And with that, I would like to bring this webinar to a close. And I want to once again say thank you to our esteemed panelist, Mr. Harold Obiga, and all the audience for joining us. And thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Doctor, and thank you all audience. Thank you.
Thank you.